My name's Michelle. I'm the Research and Collections Coordinator at the Des Museum. Today I brought in a Civil War era bugle. At the museum, my role is to take care of our collection. We're open year-round to the public, and our collection is extensive.
Following rapid territorial expansion between 1803 and 1854, the North and South of America clashed over whether or not to declare the new states as free from slavery as an economic institution. Taking office in 1861, President Abraham Lincoln and his Republican Party would eventually support abolition as a political and economic movement. The Confederacy opposed this and aimed to secede the Union, thereby protecting their perceived right to continue the devastating practice of slavery. Beginning in Fort Sumter, South Carolina, the American Civil War would unfold as the deadliest domestic battle ever fought in U.S. history, the bloodshed all their own. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, ending the war and prohibiting slavery in the rebellious Confederate States. Initially, the Confederacy withheld its surrender, but 2 years later, the Union and its promise of a liberated future for all those previously enslaved ultimately prevailed.
Well, I'd like to welcome you, Michelle, to the show. And you brought an interesting item today that really is kind of a significant piece, actually, in a lot of sense. But it's sort of an unloved piece in a lot of sense because obviously it's been around and been used. Is this actually on permanent display? If you go to the museum today, you'll be able to see it?
It is, yeah. It's in our permanent gallery along with a flute and a violin right as soon as you walk in the museum.
So it does hold a fairly significant place, actually, in your organization's collection.
It does, yeah. It's been on display at least as long as I've been at the museum. It was donated in 1982, and the donor had actually collected it as part of his personal collection, and he donated a number of artifacts.
Okay, and we assume it is a Civil War era bugle, and it certainly has every appearance of that.
Yeah.
So the American Civil War America was divided in the 1860s. We had the Confederacy in the South and we had the Union Army in the North. And it was probably one of the most bloodiest and violent wars throughout that period. There was over 140 bugle calls specifically that they were using that were based on playing the bugle to communicate to the troops. This is what they would listen for, would be the bugle calls, and that would be either to prepare, to get up, to move, to put your bayonets on, to change formation, and it was constant. So they were really looking for that. So obviously, the sound of war was pretty much men fighting across the fields of northern U.S., and southern U.S., but also running across vast tracts of land. And you look at battles like obviously Gettysburg was huge. I mean, it was just over farmland, and you would hear obviously the gunfire, but also you'd hear the bugle calls going throughout. And that was the only really way that they could communicate with the troops on the field at the same time and actually try and coordinate them that way.
So who would have been using the bugle?
The bugle would have been assigned to a private or a basic level soldier who would be assigned to obviously an officer within either the Confederate Army or the Union Army. The armies seemed to be used to the bugle was very similar throughout the course of the Civil War in a sense that they had buglers that were actually soldiers working within the camps, and then they would be responsible for giving the messages to the troops so that they would listen to bugle calls as they sat in their tents waiting for what was happening next. And then once the transition to fight and on the battlefields, they would have had buglers assigned to the ground troops, but also cavalry troops as well too. And cavalry would be a big part of that moving forward, and they would listen for the bugle calls to do it. And you're seeing, obviously, my opinion is that this was probably a cavalry one, but just based on the amounts of dings and dents on it, would have been basically strapped to a saddle, and they would be using the call, and the soldier would grab it and make the sounds and then move on depending on what they wanted to do with it. Again, it was very much a big part of both the Union and the Confederate armies. That bugle really was the only way that they were communicating. It is yes an instrument, but at the same time it's a military communications instrument, and I think that's the better story that it tells. The American Civil War was a tremendously hard-fought war. It was very bloody, very the scales of the battles, and again, 1860s, it's hard to believe it's not that long ago that basically America was torn apart between the Union armies of the North and the Confederate armies of the South. a significant amount of men were lost on these vast battlefields. And even today, you can go throughout the US and visit the battlefields, and Gettysburg obviously is the big example of that. There's a huge number of items that relate to the Civil War even today, and obviously we're seeing that example of that that's come as far here to Nova Scotia. The bugle represents that part of the war, and it represents being used as a war item. I mean, that's what it is. And certainly the American Civil War was a challenge for the US, and even today you can still see the similarities of the cracks even today in modern day America. If someone wants to see it, is this bugle on display at the museum?
It is. It's in our permanent gallery. It says that it was part of the Civil War, but that's about as far as the information goes that we have on it currently.
So obviously there's a bit more to it now, and there's a genesis here for another exhibit, I guess,
Yeah.
to the role of the Confederacy of the American Civil War in relation to Lunenburg County, I guess, to some degree.
Absolutely. And I know we're talking about an American war, but we do have a banner, like an anti-Confederate banner, which is from Bridgewater. And Lunenburg County was 67% in the vote anti-Confederate. So there is a little bit of a political draw there from Lunenburg County, even though we're discussing an American war.
And again, that's the ties between, obviously, Nova Scotia and the New England states has always been very strong, I think, throughout history.
Absolutely.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Michelle, for bringing the artifact in today and presenting an interesting story to our viewing audience.
No problem.